the moment.
Okay. Any changes to the agenda?
No, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Public comment. I have a few speaker slips here. We'll start with Peter Marin, and Catherine, you're giving your 2 minutes. So you have up to 4 minutes, and then Phil Walker.
Yes, I just wanted to fill you in on a few developments. I sent a couple of you a copy of Carol Sobel's complaint to the Coastal Commission about the City of Los Angeles ban on RVs in the coastal area. It's not exactly the same kind of ban as you are proposing here, but it is quite possible that any decision they make about her complaint will also apply in certain ways to Santa Barbara. I wrote a note to Carol this morning and asked her if this was the beginning of the end of her process in Los Angeles, and she said no, she's going to go after them. And I want you to remember that the sleeping case, which she won in Los Angeles, affected up here in Santa Barbara, and it may well be any kind of victory pertaining to RVs down there will also be applicable up here. Beyond that, she has agreed to assist us in our lawsuit, though not to represent us. Past that, I went down yesterday to talk to the division officer of the CRLA, California Rural Legal Assistance in Oxnard, and much to my surprise, she invited us to provide more materials so she can discuss whether, with her superiors, whether or not they are interested in weighing in on the case here in Santa Barbara. That much surprised me, but it seems to me that they're more interested than I thought they would be. And beyond that, we're supposed to meet this afternoon with a couple of Sprinter van owners who seem at least interested in what we're doing in relation to the city. Having said all that, I want to say this. I still believe that the kind of overkill going on here, we are very anxious to cooperate with the city as our RV owners in finding a solution that works for RV owners and that works for the city as well in controlling where RVs are and what they do. The city took the lead on this with the safe parking program, and it's been used as an example for other cities. I'm here to plead with you and to suggest that you can do the same thing in relation to RVs now, that you can get out ahead of the curve and provide a solution to the problem rather than proceeding in the way we're doing and inviting all kinds of legal actions and legal problems. That's about it. I will say one more thing. For those of us who are older, the absence of benches anywhere in the vicinity of City Hall, including downstairs, is really inappropriate. I know you're afraid of homeless people, but some of us regular people would like benches to sit on. Thank you.
Thank you. Phil Walker?
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. I was out doing some light gardening. That's how I warm up. And between 12:15 and 12:30 today, it's amazing. It's on the Monday and Tuesday, the street sweeping days, the fast and furious guys in their rice rockets, but I see some tricked out BMWs too, and motorcycles. They were having a field day. And I've guesstimated 55, 60 miles an hour. I'm on the high point of 500 between Voluntario and Alisos. And what they did with the brick pedestrian refuge islands, they're not working. They're not a refuge. I wouldn't want to be on them at times, but they're an obstacle, a challenge to a lot of these guys. They're a chicane, and it causes enhanced speeding at certain times of the week, Monday and Tuesdays, when one side of the street is free and clear of vehicles. And, sometimes somebody could get out there around noontime with a radar gun and just clock a couple speeds, hide in the bushes. Might be good. One other quick thing. You're all well aware, I'm sure, of what's been happening up in Oroville with the Lake Oroville, the spillway concerns. When I first saw the pictures of the concrete spillway chute, first thing I saw was a lot of slab jacked up, and it looked like a 4.5, 5 foot thick slab, massive concrete in that spillway chute. But then I saw the reddishness, and talking to some people, there is a lot of adobe up in that area, and 4 or 5 years of dry time before they've had the last 2 years of heavy rains, it has caused depressions, spalling underneath. Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. And the city is far ahead with their risk management, asset management program, looking at the structures.
Thank you. Crucito Herrera Cruz will be the final speaker.
Good afternoon, Mayor Schneider and council members. Crucito Herrera Cruz is before you in the sense of we have to be cognizant of these homeland security, ICE, deportation security checkpoints. We've never been a sanctuary city, but this city has been crucially dependent on this tourism industry. Thus, they're dependent on a population that is never given the citizenship, is never given the full equality of a full vote. Thus, they're creating second, maybe even third-class citizenship within our city of Santa Barbara. That's why we sued for the California Voting Rights Act, because the equity of the ideology of the thought was Eurocentric. Again, we have to look at this from a constitutional basis. There's fundamental rights. There's children's. There's families. In preparing taxes for over 15 years, I've understand that everyone obeys the law under one banner. They pay the same taxes proportionately, and even then some more, but never have the representation. Thus, I never heard any political stance from this dais. I'm very disappointed. You pump up tourism dependent on this labor class, but never give them the sufficient rights, constitutionally speaking. I would like a moment of silence for Brian Carreno, who died at the hands of police brutality and police violence. He was a product of our community. Again, you who are Jewish in descent should not condone racism, Ms. Schneider. Those that discriminate against Raza, Latinos, Mexican Americans is very troublesome at these times. So hopefully you have the political gall to stand against racism.
That concludes public comment. Move on to the consent calendar. And I think you have an item or two to read.
We have 2 items. Item 2, subject management position changes at Library Department. Recommendation that Council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara amending Resolution 16045, the position and salary control resolution for fiscal year 2017, affecting the Library Department effective February 14th, 2017. And item 7, Police Management Association Memorandum of Understanding. Recommendation that Council ratify the Memorandum of Understanding between the City of Santa Barbara and the Santa Barbara Police Management Association for the period of January 1, 2017 through January 31st, 2017, by introduction and subsequent adoption of, by reading of title only, an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara adopting the 2017 Memorandum of Understanding between the City of Santa Barbara and the Santa Barbara Police Management Association.
Thank you. Without further objection, we'll waive further reading. Is there a motion, or does someone need to pull an item? No, item 4. Did you want to pull? Okay. If you can, could you read item 4?
Item 4, subject Acela Project Fund transfers.
Thank you. Mr. Dominguez, you had a question?
I wanted to ask about the, it looks like we're shifting some money from one budget to another and from reserves, and then also we're shifting some of this into future years. So I wanted to get a clearer picture of how this is working.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, Christy Schmidt, Director of Administrative Services. Yes, we are taking some accumulated excess funds in the Information Technology Capital Fund and transferring that to cover the purchase of the Acela project, as well as project costs that include backfilling staff that will be working on the project. The project will be funded by accumulated funds from a technology fee from Public Works and Community Development over the next several years. So they will repay the Information Technology Capital Fund from those receipts as they start to receive them beginning this year.
So we're going to basically borrow against these fees that we're collecting for the next couple of years?
Exactly. This is, I think, there was a multi-department group that really felt that this was the right product and the right time to replace the product, and that this was a good opportunity to do the right thing for what the department needed for its technology needs with some of the accumulated funds we have in the IT fund.
What is the lifespan of this product?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm going to let Marianne Knight answer that question.
Madam Mayor and Councilmember Dominguez, the lifespan of the product, we're hoping to use it indefinitely into the future, continuing to upgrade it on a regular basis. So as far as the lifespan of this particular product, they will be upgrading it on a regular basis for us, but this initial implementation will last us about a year, and then we will be using the product on an ongoing basis.
So I guess what I'm getting at is, if we're going to borrow against money in the future, I want to make sure we have the whole picture. Are we going to have to raise fees to cover other IT costs that the fees that we're borrowing against would have otherwise paid for?
No. In fact, we have accounted for all of the costs that are normally charged against this fund in determining when the loan would be repaid. So we've already included all of the ongoing maintenance costs for the product and other products that are paid for out of this fund by Community Development and Public Works. And then what is left over after those items have been paid for will go to repay the loan to IT.
So then how do we get into this position where we're having to get this advanced money?
Well, when we did our initial review of the products, the product was... we did negotiate quite a bit with the vendor to try to bring the price down, but in order to account for all the licenses that we needed for the particular product, it was more expensive than we originally had, the funds that we had available at the time.
And when did this take place?
This was last June 28th.
So in June of 2016, this was then after the council's budget process, and we had allocated a certain amount. You met the vendor, and they said, actually, it's going to cost more than what we had approved?
We...
Actually, the amount that we brought to council at the time we approved the contract did include the entire cost. We didn't do the fund transfers in order to cover that, but we did go over the fact that the cost was more than we expected and that we were going to need to transfer those funds.
And why didn't we do it back then?
Oversight.
Okay. So the three figures in the recommendation, the 138, the 226, and the 160. So some of these are moving things around, and then some of them are borrowing against the future. So what I'm trying to assess is, what was the total increased amount then that we had to make up? What was the shortfall when we went to them and they raised the price, or the price came in higher? I mean,
I believe it was $538,000 total, which would include the amount that we would be loaning this year for the backfill and next year for the backfill, but I don't have those numbers in front of me, and the $138,000 for the actual purchase price.
so that's how much more it's costing than we initially anticipated. So that's about $700,000.
That's more than what we had accumulated in the reserve fund for the technology fee at the time that we had done the purchase. Yes.
So I'm still not 100% clear on this, and I don't know if it's something worth. Is there enough time in this to push this back a week and do a little more study of this, or is this something that we need to do today?
I guess I would just ask, instead of going through this, what the concern would be and why you'd want to wait a week just to get some information. Is there something in particular that is of concern that you'd want to halt this, or you just need information that could be provided after today?
Just more information, just to see why it's costing that much more. If it's $700,000 more than we anticipated, I'd want to know. I'm sure there's a justification for that. There's a strong case to be made, but it's just not in this report. This report's only it's about a page of text, and that's this report doesn't really get into those details. It gets into more where the money's coming from, where it's going to, as opposed to the actual product and the description we've just heard.
And that was included in the June staff report when the project cost was approved. The staff report includes the details of the entire project cost, including the software purchase and implementation costs and all of the license fees kind of detailed out. But that was all approved in June.
And that would give me a chance to go back and review last June's report. I'm sure everything's fine. I just want to double check before I vote on it. Otherwise, I'm happy to go along with council.
Okay. Well, unless I see 3 or more other members wanting to hold off on this, if you're uncomfortable for today, you could abstain and get the information. That's another option, if that
Okay.
makes you feel better.
Madam
Any other
Mayor?
questions on this, Mr. Murillo?
Just a thought that we could, in the future, include the report from last time if it has information. I know in land use decisions we attach what the Planning Commission deliberated on and had to say, so that would be helpful for next time. But I'm ready to vote for it to go forward.
Okay. So it sounds like all the information we've looked at just is not all right here in front of us. So do you want to vote on this separately then? Or?
Yes, please.
Okay. So can we have a motion for item 4? Moved by Rouse, second by White. All in favor?
Aye.
And do you want to say no, or you're abstaining? Mr. Dominguez is abstaining. Okay. Thank you very much. Anything else on the consent calendar, or is there a motion to approve it?
Move the rest of the consent calendar, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Is there a second? Moved by Murillo, second by Dominguez. All in favor?
Aye.
Great. All right. On to item number. Oh, we have a report from the Ordinance Committee first. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The Ordinance Committee met today to talk about post-disaster regulations as they pertain to historical structures within the city, and mostly about how and when to demolish, how and when to preserve. And we have a number of findings that we'll be presenting along with other information. We have about 2 or 3 more meetings scheduled on this particular subject, so we'll bring it. We had a nice, tidy little package for you.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Item number 9.
Item 9, policy requiring story pole installation for certain development projects.
Thank you, Ms. Brooke.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and council members. I'm Renee Brooks, City Planner, and today, as the item was introduced, we'll be discussing recommended policy for when to require story poles for projects that are being proposed under the Average Unit Size Density Incentive Program. And we're here today for this discussion due to direction from City Council on December 13th, when I was before your council to discuss with you several implementation work program items regarding the AUD program. And one of the motions from that council's discussion was for staff to return with a policy requiring story poles for certain AUD projects. By way of background, I'd like to just briefly go over what our current stated purpose of visual aid requirements are, as we have them as handouts and guidelines to our boards and commissions. Generally, they're required to aid in the review for general plan and LCP consistency, to assist in environmental review, to assist the design boards and planning commission in review of projects for their size, bulk, and scale and compatibility with the neighborhood, and also to assess how impacts to public scenic views could be minimized. There are many examples of visual aids, and story poles are just one of those. So what I've listed here are several other types of visual aids that either staff or decision-making bodies might ask for when they're reviewing development projects. I will note, though, story poles are really the only form of visual aid that is currently used by the city that also provides notice to the public that a project of a certain size is being proposed on a site. Otherwise, one would need to follow the hearing, the design review hearing, if they wanted to see photo simulations or other forms of visual aids. The story poles on the site really are another form of widespread public notification. We do also currently have thresholds for when story poles are required for projects that must go to the Planning Commission or the Staff Hearing Officer for decision. Those stated thresholds are for non-residential or multi-unit projects that exceed 17 feet in height and single-family units in certain circumstances. And it has to be a pretty visible single-family home on a ridge line or significantly presumed to be out of scale with the neighborhood in order to require story poles for single-family homes. Currently, for projects that only require ABR, HLC, or SFDB review, story poles are required only when one of those design bodies requests them from the applicant. And as you're aware, now that projects proposed under the AUD incentive program largely rest with a decision made by the HLC or ABR, it would be only when they ask for story poles for these projects would we see them. And so far, they have very rarely asked for those poles to date. What I've shown here is a couple examples of story poles installed in the last couple of years. One is 1298 Coast Village Road here, and then another example here of the Alma de Pueblo. A little difficult to see those, but I just wanted to give you a visual sense of how they can range in both material used, complexity, and so the cost of story pole installation can range as well. I do hear most dollar figures mentioned are between $10,000 and $20,000 to install poles for a development. They can get more expensive depending on the amount of detail that's conveyed in the poles, how many poles are used, the material, the complexity of installing the poles around existing development, and sometimes just the length of time where they need to have hired labor to help them install the poles. So in order to prepare a staff recommendation for your consideration, we checked in with the Historic Landmarks Commission and ABR to get their input on what they would feel would be appropriate thresholds to require story poles as they're reviewing these projects. And these points here on the slide were points of agreement between the HLC and ABR, and we've carried these forward in our staff recommendation. They believe the story poles for AUD projects should be required whenever a project is 3 stories or 30 feet in height, proposed in a residential zone, or where there are not 3-story buildings within 300 feet of the site. So in other words, it's being proposed as one of the first ones generally within a half block. They also believe a proper threshold is when the project either triggers a requirement for Planning Commission comments per the municipal code, or when the ABR or HLC specifically refer the project to the Planning Commission for comments. And then both the HLC and ABR wanted to retain their discretion to require poles in any other circumstance where they deemed worthy if, for instance, they were having difficulty making the compatibility criteria or the other visual aids just weren't quite convincing them that they felt it was compatible with the neighborhood. So those were points of agreement. They also wanted to retain the ability to exempt certain projects from requiring story poles. The reason being, even with some of these triggers, it's difficult to address every scenario that might come before the Board of Commission. They wanted to have some flexibility to not mandate the construction of the poles if they felt very comfortable with the neighborhood compatibility. And so that, too, is another aspect that we've carried forward in our recommendation. 2 points here to there wasn't necessarily disagreement, but they're just much more specific requirements for when to require story poles. The ABR mentioned a threshold of any 4-story building located in the city. AUD project should be required to install story poles. When we returned to the Historic Landmarks Commission and posed that question to them, they felt more comfortable being able to review 4-story buildings inside El Pueblo Viejo, and so did not feel that that was necessary for their review of projects. But HLC did ask that another threshold be added, that when an AUD project is proposed within 100 feet of a designated historic resource, and that could be either ABR or HLC, regardless of jurisdiction, because we do have historic resources outside of EPV. So with all of that taken together, staff has proposed a recommended policy for you that's detailed in the resolution attached to the agenda report that essentially summarizes it in these points. We recommend that story poles for AUD projects would be required for 4-story projects outside of EPV, a 3-story project or 30 feet in height or more in a residential zone, or in any zone where another building of that size does not exist within 300 feet. AUD projects within 150 feet of a designated historic resource. Projects for which Planning Commission comments are either required or requested. And then at the discretion of the ABR or HLC, as I mentioned, in those circumstances where it might not otherwise hit one of these thresholds, but they do believe that story poles would aid in their review of projects. Also added into staff's recommendation and in the resolution is the ability for ABR HLC to exempt a project from requiring story poles, and we do have this existing exemption in our procedures for when story poles are required for for Planning Commission or staff hearing officer projects. They may choose to not need story poles constructed if they can clearly tell it's consistent with size, bulk, and scale and the rest of the buildings in the neighborhood, that the structure proposed is the same height or smaller than existing buildings. They could tell that it would not block or substantially reduce important scenic views, not proposed on a ridgeline, or if they deem that the site just doesn't allow adequate story pole installation. And that could be either due to really dense vegetation or a site that's completely built out already, lot line to lot line. It can be difficult in those cases to construct story poles. So in conclusion, our recommendation is to adopt the resolution that's attached to the report that establishes requirements for installation of story poles for certain projects proposed under the AUD program. I do want to point out there's a minor typo in the resolution. As we number the sections of the resolution, there are 2 section 3s, so there should be section 1, section 2, 3, and 4. So I just want to note that, and we can correct that after the meeting. I do also want to note, I've invited Mr. Bill Lavoie here from the HLC and Kirk Gradine from the ABR. Thank you. He's also here to provide input on their recommendations if you have any questions for them about that.
Why don't we invite them at this point, if either of you have any comments that you'd like to make at this point, and then we can open it for questions before public comment. And thank you for your work. Good afternoon.
You're very welcome, Mayor Schneider, members of the council. We were in support of this. We like the option of asking for these because we've never asked for them before. But we've recently reviewed a project that looks like a good candidate for asking for story poles. Most of what we see is urban infill, so it's easy to see how big the buildings are adjacent. So if those are provided as part of the submittal, we can tell the building either fits or doesn't fit. And so far, we've not gotten into a fight with the applicant over it's too big. They usually respond to our comments and reduce the size of the building so that it does fit in or do certain things to the building. So it's not been a contest at this point. But that doesn't mean it won't be the next project. So we do appreciate the fact that the AUD is a setup for violating the character of the neighborhood. It unfortunately is. Some applicants push that boundary and some are more responsive to the neighborhood. So it is necessary at times to sort of say, okay, prove to us with this 3D configuration that your building is not going to be as big as we think it is. So we do support these conditions in your effort to clarify the requirements.
Thank you. Mr. Goodine, did you have a question, Ms. Murray?
I do, Mr. Lavoie.
Mr. Lavoie, if you can come on back.
So you know that we have a policy, we're in a housing crunch, and we have a policy, we rezoned some areas where we're allowing some density and maybe something taller than a one-story building. Is your design review board able to recognize that we have a housing policy that we're trying to implement?
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay.
We have been lectured by staff that there are certain things we can comment on and certain things we can't. And usually the nexus of our discussion is this compatible with the neighborhood? Can we make compatibility findings? And quite often these buildings are bigger than what's around them. But how much bigger? It becomes a question.
I think that's what I'm worried about, is that of course we're trying to maintain Santa Barbara, beautiful small town feel. We also have a housing crunch, and so we're looking to be able to allow that very first project that is going to be a little bit taller than the rest of the neighborhood.
Okay. But we also, prior to the AUD, you adopted the neighborhood compatibility findings, which we're required to make in order to approve a project, and that is sort of the litmus test quite often. There's incremental growth, and then there is outrageous growth. My experience with the commission has been we have allowed incremental growth. They are often taller than the adjacent buildings.
Okay.
But compatible. And there are ways of breaking up a big building and making it fit in, and you massage it and manipulate it. And quite often, I think it's been successful.
Thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Gradine, did you want to add anything at this point? Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Mayor Schneider, council members, I think the question that was just asked really gets to the gist of the problem, because we have the famous issue of the first project, AUD project, that's proposed in a neighborhood which is predominantly one story or few two stories, and it's 3-story. So how do you design that building so that it still fits within that neighborhood, given your design goals and your program? So, and that is something that we struggle with every time we see an AUD project, or nearly every time. Sometimes, there are bigger buildings nearby which help to place it, but it really can depend on the skill of the architect as well. But I just wanted to add one thing that I didn't mention as we were going through this process with Renee Brooke to help kind of define where story poles would be required. And I think there's one thing that's missing, and that is where a 3-story project, or that is 30 feet or more in an R3 or R4 zone, and where there are not others within 300 feet, I think it should be added also. It's a little bit, the wording would need to be carefully crafted. But the additional stipulation there, in my view, would be where a footprint for the new development is 3 or more times the footprint of existing 3-story developments. So in other words, we've seen projects recently that take up a whole block and have other projects that are within 300 feet, which are 3 stories, but that 3 stories may be, 300 square feet. That is the 3rd-story element is 300 square feet, whereas we're looking at, a 3,000 square foot 3rd-story element. So if you provide that additional stipulation that projects within 300 feet, if they're exceeded by the proposed development by 3 times or more in their third floor footprint, then that's another occasion where story poles should be required. So those are my comments. If you have any questions,
we do, Mr. Hotchkiss.
There is considerable discretion allowed to ABR as proposed here. Does that not cover the conditions you just wanted to make mandatory?
Well, of course, ABR can, as you know, request story polls. In my mind, the issue is that if a particular board member requests story polls, they become the bad guy. And so, and so I think it's almost like peer pressure, community pressure, from both sides. The public would like to see story polls. The applicant and the architects, and in many cases the architectural community, maybe you'll hear from some of them today, feel that it's because of the cost involved and the time delay that it's really unreasonable, especially when you get these very sophisticated 3D graphics showing massing of adjacent structures and how the new is going to fit in with the old and so on. If you can provide those, and that's kind of been our fallback position up until now, was that if you can provide adequate modeling that allows us to visualize how something's going to fit or not fit, then you shouldn't be required to provide story polls. But sometimes and often, the viewpoint you select and the way you model it can make it appear less impactful, less or more fitting within the neighborhood than it's actually going to be. And so I think, to me, that's why we should have, in my mind, defined parameters, predefined parameters of when story polls are required and when they're not. So it just automatically kicks in. And then applicants know and architects know, they know before they go before the board when they're going to be required to provide story polls. It's a done deal. And it's not a question mark. It's not a discretionary call by a particular architect on the board.
But your board, people make judgments one way or the other all the time. And it's supposed to be independent of either their fellow architectural peers, but take the public view, the broader audience, if I can put it that way.
That's right.
Are they doing that now, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a struggle every meeting. It's a struggle, and I think you must feel it as well. And the public is not of a uniform viewpoint.
No.
So sometimes you get conflicting views. And now I think the other thing that's happening is developers, applicants are becoming more savvy, and so they solicit good responses. We get people coming in front of the ABR. You get 4 or 5 public comments saying we're in support of this. Well, these are not people that live nearby necessarily. They live somewhere in town, and maybe they just know the applicant, and the applicant has asked them to respond to the project. So you don't really know. You don't know. The underlying point is you don't really know what's generating public comment. Often, we also get, complaints against projects in which there's really no legitimate standpoint for it, right? That someone's worried that it's going to block their view. Well, they're 2 doors away. Maybe they're on the next block, and they bring pictures, telling us, well, this is going to block my view. But in fact, we can tell as architects it's not.
Right.
So there's pressure on both sides. Some of it legitimate, some of it not. So you have to balance that. You have to and try to be as impartial as possible, knowing that, as mentioned, we have a community problem regarding housing, and we've been given guidelines, new guidelines. The AUD provides a program that's meant to, provide housing, additional housing in this community where it's sorely needed. So there's a community need right there. So you have to balance that with the architectural design. Is it fitting in the neighborhood? So I think it's a struggle every time.
And maybe staff down the line could address this. Thank you.
Sure.
Still have some, don't go just yet, Mr. Hart and then Mr. Dominguez.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Mr. Reed, for your service on the ABR. And I think you described the challenge really well. I mean, that is your task to sort through all those competing interests and needs. And sometimes we get the appeals and we have to do the same thing. So I appreciate you understanding the task. My understanding from Mr. Lavoie's comments were that as far as the HLC is concerned, they have the advantage of context of larger buildings often, and that they haven't historically or generally found the need for story polls, but find that if we're going to do it, here's a policy to do it. Was that a compelling interest of the ABR prior to this coming down from the council and asking for your support or consideration of a story poll policy? Was this something that was, that the ABR was asking for of staff? How did this come about?
Well, I think it was staff generated initially. That's my understanding from what Mr. Lamone told me.
Okay.
So it was not something that we were asking for.
Okay.
But I think we're also just getting up to speed when because just in the last couple of weeks, for example, we've reviewed another AUD project that was literally an entire block, and this is a second of its kind, really, that was that large, or maybe third or fourth, actually. Now that I'm thinking about it. But I think and some of the presentations are really by the most skilled architects that we have in town. And the buildings are beautiful. They're very well designed, but they're definitely out of scale with what's around it. There's no question. They're out of scale. So how do you respond to that? And what's the best way to respond to that? And up till now, we've been relying, as I've mentioned, on 3D modeling as to help us get a better perspective. Context. But I think once it was brought to our attention that this was a question that was coming up, as a board, when we talked about it, it was a unanimous agreement that there should simply be some guidelines in which story poles would be required. That would not just help the board to visualize and put it in context, but help the community to understand it before it was going to get built.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Dominguez?
I'm afraid I didn't understand your example.
Okay.
I didn't understand your example of the block with one-story houses and then a three-story building wants to be developed. What was the...
Right. Well, I probably didn't explain it well. But, and if I could draw pictures, I could do a better job probably. But the idea is that if you have a new project that's proposed and the third-story element is 3,000 square feet of third story, and they're strictly following this guideline, if half a block away there was another three-story building, but the third story was only 300 square feet, they would not have to put up story poles because there's another three-story building within 300 square feet. But the overall impact and mass of that third-story element for the proposed is much greater than that little third-story element that's half a block away. So that's why I'm saying if the new exceeds anything within 300 feet, not just in height, but also in footprint. So it not only has to be another building within 300 feet that's 3 stories or more, but it has to have a footprint that's at least 1/3 the size of the proposed footprint. To me, that's just, if it doesn't meet that criteria, it's just like a red flag. This is probably a building that's out of context for its neighborhood. And there's ways to get around that in terms of design, sophistication of design, but still it's alerting. Should be alerting to board members and to the community. This is going to be a big building. So that was the thought.
Thank you.
Don't go yet. We got Mr. Rouse and then Mr. White.
Mr. Green, you mentioned 3D modeling as a way to communicate design, mass, and scale for your projects. And were you saying that in some cases it's not adequate and that poles would be a better way to communicate that? And my second part of my question is, can that kind of imagery or modeling or renderings be adequate to communicate to the community at large, if given that was posted in the proper areas and the proper perspectives? So I'm struggling with this. Do you actually need to go to the physical story poles, or can it be supplanted by adequate 3D modeling, in your opinion?
That's a great question, and it depends on a number of factors. Number one, the way the story poles are constructed, if they're adequately constructed and properly, so that you can actually get a sense of where the major massing impacts are going to be in relation to the neighborhood or adjacent structures. That's one issue. The other is that, as I kind of briefly skipped over it, but with 3D modeling, you still have to pick a viewpoint from where you're viewing the three-story massing. And a very skilled architect, or even a moderately skilled architect, can, just by moving their mouse around, figure out the spot that's going to look like it's going to have the least impact. And that's, standing in the street, street level view perhaps, but it depends on where you are in the street and how far away you are and what you're including and what you're excluding. So 3D modeling can also be very distorted perspective, sometimes one way or the other. For example, sometimes just to get a 3D view, you have to eliminate certain things that would otherwise be in the way, like a big tree. So if you're standing across the street, it could be, I don't want to go on too long, but it could be, for example, that standing across the street, looking at this building, it would look very impactful. But in fact, if you go out to that location in the street, there's actually a big tree in the way that's going to block your being able to stand and get the view from that position. So in that case, the 3D modeling, you would have to eliminate that tree in order to present it to the board, right? So is that a realistic modeling or is it not? And that happens all the time. There are certain things that you have to leave out, that you can choose to leave out. There's angles that you can choose where you're going to view the building from that's either going to look like it's more impactful or less impactful. So often it's a very helpful tool. There's no question about that. Very helpful tool. And I'm not suggesting we do away with that tool. But sometimes what a story pole allows you to do is walk up and down the street, see it from different angles, different viewpoints. You can choose your viewpoint. You can go, you can knock on the neighbor's door and talk to them about it if you want to. See it from half a block away, another direction, and so on. So it allows you to get this 3D perspective that you simply can't get with modeling.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And thank you, Mr. Grudin, for your work. It's great having a seasoned veteran such as yourself in one of the hot seats as we are working on this experiment, which is the part of the driver behind this whole thing. We're trying something new, and I appreciate all the experience that you've had working on projects. One quirky piece that arose out of a conversation I had with our friend Bill Mahan was about the northeast corners of all streets, that they tend to be more sensitive. Is that something that is that a flag for you? And I know Mr. Kernell's here too, and I'm going to ask a similar kind of question there. Is that something that when you're observing projects or designing one yourself that you feel it takes a different kind of tenderness or perspective? Mountain views being, of course, a key element from that perspective.
Well, I guess I'm not sure why the northeast corner would be more impactful than the southeast or the southwest corner. I think anytime there's a corner building, you're being, you're seeing it from two sides. So the massing at that corner is going to have a greater impact than something that's mid-block, for example.
Okay.
But the only thing I can think of that why northeast is especially impactful is because it's going to block the rising sun and the southern sun, which is where it's located in the sky most of the year. So you not only are looking at that building, but you're in the shadow of that building most of the year. So maybe that's it.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have any questions for you.
Darn.
But thank you.
All right.
Thank you for your work again. Okay. Any other questions before I go to public comment? All right, let's go to public comment. We'll start with Brian Kernell, who'll be followed by Lindsay Baker. Good afternoon.
Can you switch me, Renee? Oh, thank you. Madam Mayor.
I'm sorry, what?
Mickey's giving me her time.
You have it. Oh, okay, didn't say so. So you're giving your, okay, so you have up to 4 minutes, Mr. Kernell.
Let me get this started. I admit I'm not a big fan of story poles, having had a lot of projects with story poles, and yet I acknowledge that there are times when story poles play a very important role. I think when you have a specific problem where you're concerned particularly about blockage of mountain views, you are able to, as Kirk mentioned, look from different vantage points and see where that actual vista is cut off. But What I'm most concerned about here is that I think this all started with the idea that the story poles sort of become a noticing vehicle. It's the way by which you tell the neighborhood that the project is coming. And I'm so against the idea of continuing to build more regulation on regulation, which is more cost and more problems. And I think this is a case where it's not broken, and I don't think we need to fix it. Story poles are very expensive, so I'm going to run through some examples of story poles. And actually, I think this moved a little bit, so I'm going to go back. So when we did Cottage Hospital, the parking structures, we were asked to put up story poles. These story poles cost over $21,000. They were very problematic because, as you can see, a lot of them had to be put on the roofs of buildings. And at the end of the day, did it matter? Was it important? I mean, you go by Cottage Hospital now, this is the small building, right? You don't even think about the size, bulk, and scale, and yet Cottage Hospital had to pay $21,000 to put up these story poles, not to mention the nuisance to all the tenants at the time. Another project, this was about a $3,000 story pole, this is a one-story building at La Cumbre, and I'm showing you the finished product here. A one-story building it was not a mountain view issue. Obviously, there was a building behind this that maybe had more of an impact, but it was really sort of an unnecessary exercise, frankly. Now, this is another project that we had to do for a home, which you all heard on appeal. These story poles cost this homeowner about $6,000. And we had done photo sims to show how that was going to sit on the site. And that's kind of the point. The photo sims tell the story. And contrary to what Kirk was saying, we can create multiple views. When you've modeled the project, you can go ahead and pick the view. And I will tell you, we are always very careful about making sure, in fact, this is a case where we had to register the rendering to the photograph. So you have to be sure you've got exactly the right vantage point and the right angle, and that can all be done. Alma del Pueblo, these story poles cost close to $15,000, and you can see what their impact is. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the photos of the story poles, and I'm going to show you what we had already done as far as the modeling for this project. So this is a very similar view. We then inserted the model kind of halftone so you could see the buildings and whatnot behind, and then, superimposed it. And we went all around the project. This is where the story poles were. This was then the vantage point we took for that viewpoint, the building superimposed, and then the end product. And I'm not showing you the finished product because I think you're all aware of this project and realize that it really did settle in, and it was the result of an arduous effort by HLC and the Planning Commission to make sure that it settled in. And frankly, the story poles were just an extra $15,000 cost on what would have normally still resulted in this same project. They didn't change anything, in other words. Story poles, and then our view with the rendered image and the building. And then finally, in the case of mountain views, you can barely see the story poles way back in the back here. But this is what we modeled. And we're very honest about what it was. And I think it all ended up being very accurate.
Thank
you. I think the idea of the renderings being on the noticing board accomplishes what you're looking for as far as notifying the neighborhood of what is being built.
You're at 4.5 minutes, so.
Okay.
But you have a couple of questions, so I'll Ms. Murillo and then Mr. Rouse, and then I think Mr. White also had a question for you
Thank
from
you.
earlier. Go ahead.
Mr. Cornell, so I heard what Mr. Graydon said. I imagine that someone could pick the least offensive point of view, to say that the project isn't going to block some views. What if we required 3 perspectives? Is it terribly expensive to do these computer?
Well, no, I think we all do it as a matter of course now. I mean, it's just you just automatically, when we create a project design, when we put it in the computer, it's modeled and we have it for 3D views. And I think most architects are at that point now in the technology.
But how would we make a policy by which we make sure we get a good view
well,
of
look,
everything?
I mean, a project goes always conceptually to the ABR or the HLC, and it's very important. I just had lunch with Bill Mahan. It's very important that projects go early to these boards to get direction from them as to whether you're even close. I think it's important because applicants shouldn't spend too much money. Because when they spend too much money, they get invested, and that's sort of part of this whole thing. Is I'm worried that people get so invested, then they can't change the design. They feel locked in. So there's no reason the board can't say, you know what, this view, that view, that view, these are the important vantage points, and we want to see them from eye level, or we'd like to see them from looking through the window, or if you need to move that tree, fine. But, you know, they can give the applicant direction, and because you're always going to the ABR, HLC multiple times on a project. It's not just one time. And again, what my concern about this is the use of story poles as a noticing technique. I think that's just wrong, and I think that's overreach. And I think what we've got now works, and let's not create another layer.
Okay. One question about cost. So some people might think $21,000. Oh, that's nothing. You're a rich developer, but how does it hurt our goal of providing housing, which I'm just going to keep coming back to that.
Well,
today.
Look, the costs add up and add up and add up. You know, fees, architects' fees, I mean, on and on and on. Sure, I mean, every little bit of soft cost that applies to a project, and that I would consider a soft cost, is going to add to the final end product. And it sure, it does have an impact. What it means over the life of a rent, I don't know, but it still affects the cost of the project.
Thank you.
Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, Mr. Cannell, you talked about it being kind of the story polls being kind of a noticing tool, which, in a lot of ways, I think that's actually one of the positive aspects of it, because the more communication, the better at the end product. Is there a way to take the rendering tools that you have and make them more of a public noticing tool, i.e., giving the public themselves that maybe don't necessarily pay attention to the ABR agendas and the meetings, and say, this is what this neighborhood thing is going to look like? Is there something that we're not doing now that might be an improved situation? I mean, Kathy was just asking that same question, basically.
Sure, Councilmember Rouse. The easy thing is require a nice big sign. I mean, make it a 4x8 sign, whatever, that you put in front of the property, and it has to have a rendering. It has to have a site plan. It has to have the statistics of the project. There's absolutely no reason why we couldn't prepare those, and that would be a lot less expensive and a lot less impactful than story poles. Almost every single story pole installation we've had to do had some impact on the site, because it's an existing site that has tenants or users or whatever. So it's much easier to construct that sign and have that rendering and have it up.
And in your opinion, would that be just as adequate of a communication device for the public?
Well, I think it is a more than adequate communication device for the public to be able to determine if they're interested in that project. It may still be that project needs to have story poles, and I'm okay with that if that really is the result of the process and not just sort of an automatic threshold that gets triggered.
Thank you.
Mr. White, and then Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This slide is a great one for the conversation, even the question I asked Mr. Gradine about Northeast Corner. This is a Northeast Corner, and this is one of the most successful projects that I have seen in recent times. And so congratulations on that. Of course, you could sort of tease it apart and say, well, now did the story poles help in any way? Because you had to have them. But it does exemplify what I was talking about, where the mountain views are part of this equation. And I don't think that even what we saw not justifies, but is as strong as when each of us go out to this site and look at it. This project fits in so well with that monument, with our historic landmark there, that you did a brilliant job of making those things compatible. And I'll be showing a picture of another project that didn't make it to this level of excellence, but I think I got your point that you feel the renderings do the job, that the story poles are an additional expense.
And I do
it's
want to sort of
superfluous.
answer your sort of question, which is no. Have I ever seen a project change after I installed the story poles? No, because the story poles, are something that we've done the design, and then we're putting up the story poles. And that's another unintended consequence of this, is I think to really accomplish it, it means those story poles have to go up very early when the design necessarily hasn't been done and vetted. And then what? You have to put them up again? And, there's a lot of those complications that I think are going to come out of it that we don't realize. And it's a real problem if they're sticking up for a long period of time.
Sure.
You're sort of building a building before you build the building, almost.
Thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss.
In one sense, story poles are sort of a 19th century technology. And this is a 21st century technology, which is pretty impressive. Typically, do you have a website that people can go to look at these and other renderings should they have any questions about your projects?
Well, we don't. No, but I'll tell you, the city's website is so robust. They normally you can get to the project plans via the website, and so I think that's how the public can do it, is through the city's website to be able to get to the plans that are submitted. But again, I think the signage thing really solves the problem of letting the neighborhood know what the heck this project is that's being proposed.
Does this kind of rendering end up on the city page, typically?
Well, like I said, on the city page, you can get to what has been applied. I mean, what was submitted is available to the public via the. No, am I wrong?
I'm trying to ask: is it this kind of visual presentation? Is it readily available to the public, other than on a fixed painting, or what do you have?
Yeah, I don't. Renee, why don't you?
Yeah, well,
Madam
that's
Mayor,
a really
council
question for
members,
Ms. Brooke.
to clarify, we don't currently post electronic versions of plans undergoing review by the city. What we do have is right now we require 3 hard copies of plans to be submitted, and we have those available at the public counter for the public to come view in hard copy. We haven't made it a practice to post them online. We've had some resistance from some members of the professional community that don't want that material necessarily posted online. But I think as we move forward and with better technology, we might be able to do that, especially as we start to transition to electronic plan check. We'll have more electronic plan submittal, and we'll be more capable and ready to have information like this readily available on our website. But that's at least a year out.
Well, it's not plans that I'm talking about, it's renderings.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Connell.
Okay.
Okay, Lindsay Baker will be followed by Christine Newhouse.
Mayor Schneider, City Council members, I'm Lindsay Baker, co-president of the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters supports the concept of story polls. It was mentioned, a lengthy discussion, that it gives public notice. How many people are here today in the audience listening to this discussion? How many people can find a place to park along that street to get out of their car to go read a sign to understand what's being projected or proposed for that area? Story polls are public notice. The league, the city of Santa Barbara had a big issue with the bicycle master plan and the Mitchell-Torina Street plan, and public notice was a big issue. There were many complaints that there wasn't adequate public notice for that development project. So we do support story polls. We think it is public notice, and it's very important, and we would want the polls to stay up long enough. We haven't studied this matter to know how long exactly, but an adequate length of time for the public to view. Thank you.
Thank you. Christine Newhouser, followed by Anna Marie Gott.
I'm asking you to not adopt the resolution as it's written today. The resolution proposed today by city staff regarding story polls criteria for AUD projects leaves too much room for subjective and wider interpretations. The story polls notify neighbors and those that traverse daily in the affected areas. Projects of this size, many of which are combined parcels, affect more than those in the notification area of 300 feet of the project. Hence, the larger AUD project should have expanded notices and story polls to alert the neighborhood of the proposed development that affects them. The yellow notices used currently are inadequate and not legible, nor any preview as what is to come. Advising the tenants in the 300-foot radius is not enough notification for the neighborhood. Story polls should be required as mandatory for all projects over 2 stories. A substantial time frame should be required for how long the story polls remain in place to alert the surrounding affected areas. They should be installed for a reasonable time and maintained to fit their purpose, that is, to inform the public of the scope of the project. Requirements should not be waived by ABR or the Planning Commission if they're requested by neighbors and those in the proximity of the new development. Section 2 of the proposed resolution is a laundry list of subjective reasons the ABR can use to not require story polls from the developer. Please consider the impact these projects have in residential neighborhoods and the quality of life as a result.
Thank you.
Another thing, the story polls that we're talking about, these are all about AUD projects. And so AUD projects really are neighborhoods where those people are not running to their computer and looking at 3D. Right?
Okay, thank you very much. Anna Marie Gott will be followed by Alex Peugeot.
Hi, I'm speaking on behalf of Allied Neighborhood Association today. We submitted a letter to you last night, and we provided an attachment with information for some local jurisdictions that actually have story poll recommendations and requirements. One of our main issues from Allied is the time in which the polls are actually up and when they go up. They can be up on a Friday, and a decision can be made as early as a Monday morning. That is what our current requirement is for story polls. They do need to be up for a longer period of time to give the public notice. Issues like 7-Eleven Milpas might have had more comments from the public if more people had actually received notice. Oftentimes, many people are not aware of the projects. You have a very small sign that is this big, and it's yellow, and sometimes it is in front of bushes. Sometimes they are in windows, and people may not necessarily look at them. As you're driving down the street, you will not necessarily notice a yellow sign in a window, but you would certainly notice the story polls. And if they're up for a longer period of time, you are going to receive more comments from the public, more input from residents who have to live in that area or work in that area and are going to be impacted by a large development. There were some other issues that we had with story polls, and it's actually just this process. When staff went to ARB and HLC, they asked about the triggers, but they didn't ask about how long the story poll should be up, and they didn't go back to ARB or HLC and say, these are the recommendations. How do you feel about this?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question. Go ahead, Ms. Scott. Mr. Dominguez has
How long do you think the story poll should be up?
I would say that they should be up. I mean, are you asking for me or for Allied?
Allied or both?
Allied does not yet have a position on the total amount of time. We believe that we need sufficient time in which to notice the residents.
Well, it's here today.
Community.
2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 days.
And it should be after that decision is made until the appeal. Other jurisdictions are anywhere from 4 weeks to 3 weeks. I think that might be something that is acceptable to the majority members of Allied. We discussed actually making a recommendation, and we could not come to an agreement regarding that. But we certainly felt that we needed far more time than we currently have, because people it's not an instantaneous experience in terms of driving down a street and seeing a story pole and go, I'm going to call the city, or I'm going to find out exactly, what that is. If you see something on a Friday, it might be, the next week or the week after before you actually take the time to call the city, if you can even get someone at the planning department to pick up the phone. So it's something that people it has to be up long enough so they can not only have the time to find out more about it, but then write a letter or take time out of their day in which to actually go to a meeting. So I don't necessarily think that maybe even 2 weeks is enough time. Maybe it's a little bit more than that. I think you just have to think about how people typically respond.
Okay, thank you. Alex Peugeot will be followed by Natalia Giovanni.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, Council members. I'm Alex Peugeot. I served 2 terms in the Architectural Board of Review, followed by other 2 terms at the Landmarks Commission. And now I'm currently in the County South Coast Board of Architectural Review, where we do see quite a bit of story poles erected. But I would like to say that the purpose of those story poles is different. We see them quite often on Padaro Lane, on beachfront properties, sometimes on ridge lines, sometimes in locations where you don't expect to see a structure, not in the downtown area, not in an area specifically designated in the general plan for more intense development. So there is a different, a different goal of the story poles that the county requires. And I think Mr. Carnell showed another way of achieving the same goal, and a better way, perhaps. As to the questions as to whether you can cheat using computer modeling, I would suggest that the city should institute parameters on which these computer modeling presentations should comply to, including worst-case scenarios. Just indicate what are the worst possible locations where this view can be blocked or this project can be seen. And they can also be posted online. The renderings can go online, as has been suggested, and that would be an easy way for people to access these presentations. But I also like to address this other item that staff calls the second purpose of story poles, which is notification. And as we hear from the public, it seems to be like drive-by notification, like an alarm. And because the reason that you see most architects not very supportive of story poles, besides the reasons being made, is that they present your project in the most unflattering view. There is nothing worse than a page that says, okay, this is going to be here, and you don't see all the nuances. The glazed terracotta tile of the Granada Theater, that wouldn't be there. You just see a blank wall. Okay. It is the worst way to say hello to your neighbors. It's just to say, well, this is coming your way. It's going to be huge. Thank you.
Thank you. Natalia Giovanni and then Deddy Pikert.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and fellow council members. If you were to measure temperature, wouldn't you use a thermometer as an indicator? Story poles are a community's thermometer, where people can see the impact, size, and scale of a project, thereby visually judging the potential ramifications to a neighborhood. So it is only reasonable and understandable that greater weight be given to those impacted. Is this for Planning Commission, staff, developers, City Council, or the whole community? So, just like you would not leave your home without checking the temperature, why would you not require implementation of story poles for projects of larger size and structure? Thank you.
Thank you. Deddy Pikert, and I see Lisa Plowman, you're donating your 2 minutes, so you have up to 4 minutes, and then Ellen Bildstein will be after you.
Thank you. Madam Mayor, members of council, again, I'm here really to speak to the idea that I think story poles in general really aren't very useful. They're, as previously mentioned, they're expensive, and they can even be dangerous. They have to be built just so if there was a storm or something, something could certainly happen to create a bad situation. Actually, I'm very much in line with Councilmember Hotchkiss's comments that story poles are kind of a 20th century technology or earlier, and we're in the 21st century. We don't use typewriters anymore, and most people don't have a fax machine. And we now have the technology to do very accurate visualization. I think that's far superior to, I'm not sure why that's flashing around like that, but maybe it'll stabilize there. To be able to visualize very accurately in a way that provides much more robust information to anyone interested in seeing what is actually being proposed on a site. What I have here is a picture of the Milpas site where what you're looking at is actually a simulation of what story poles would have looked like had we employed them in this particular instance. I apologize for whatever's going on with the technology, the 21st century technology here. My iPad. But here you see what a photo simulation would look like, simulation, I should say, of the building that's actually been proposed and approved on the site. And here's another view of it with, again, I apologize, with the simulated story poles. And here's the actual drawing of the building itself. And again, you can see there's just so much more information in that. So we just think that that if we can find a method where these photo simulations can be communicated to the public, as Brian mentioned, by having a large sign with a rendering on it, and I think ideally there should be a web address, a URL indicated on the sign, so that anybody driving by can go home and look it up on their computer, plug it in. They can immediately go to a series of photo sims, not just the one rendered view, but we can create as many as are needed or are necessary, desirable, because once we've created that three-dimensional model, you can really look at the building from any perspective, any vantage point that is needed or desirable. And I think it's just a far superior method for communicating the information about what is being proposed on a project site. I think one other aspect of it that is worth considering is establishing some standards for how you generate an accurate three-dimensional view of a project. I've got some ideas about how that could be done. I think that's an important aspect of it as well, and that determination be made probably at the design review level to determine how many views, which particular views are necessary or desirable to effectively communicate to the public what's being proposed. And I think I would really like to see a lot more discretion employed as to whether or not story poles would be needed for a particular project. Maybe there are instances where it would be a useful tool, but I think, again, coming back to the idea of the 21st century, we have the tools to be able to illustrate what is being proposed for a particular site with the technology that we have available now. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rouse has a question.
Mr. Packard. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So what you're saying is what we should be focusing on instead of some kind of new story pole regulations would be perhaps some new requirements or different requirements for visual aids for the general public to be able to get a better perspective on a proposed project?
I'm going to unplug this because it's not...
Yeah, not that particular one, though. That's probably not going to do it for you.
Yeah. So, yes, I think that we can establish some standards to objectively show that the particular illustration is accurate as to height and placement and mass and all of that. That's pretty easy to achieve. I think the other standard is what's the methodology for communicating it to the public. I think a website that could be on the city's website, if you have a URL, you don't have to plow through multiple menus or anything to get there. It can get you right to the website. In your noticing, you could send out that same link to affected property owners so that they can immediately have instant access to the various views that we're presenting for the project. I think those are some of the things that we can employ.
So would you agree that it would enhance public, not noticing per se of the project, but enhance public perception of what the project is ultimately going to be would be a good thing?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ms. Murillo and then Mr. Dominguez.
Thanks. So do you like the idea of a giant poster on the street? I think that's what Mr. Cornell, I'm not sure what he called it, a 4x8 like
Right, it would be
rendering?
a sign, like a construction sign sort of thing, a noticing sign. Yeah, I think that's a great idea as well. I think that is certainly giving notice to anyone who is driving by that there's a project proposed. They get an immediate ability to view what that project is, as opposed to some flags flying around in the air. And then with a large URL, meaning a website link, printed on there, people can take note of it, and then they can go to a website and they can view it. And if anybody is being noticed specifically because of their proximity to a project, they could be emailed the same web address so that they can have access to those documents.
Well, we're transitioning to the district representation system, and for me, on the west side, our neighborhood group is really a hub of land use. We have a lot of different issues on the west side, but do you get invited to neighborhood association meetings to talk about your projects? Because I think that will be the wave of the future, as each council member is responsible, for land use and other city business within their district.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, I think that is a really, really important aspect of the process for submitting and getting approval for any project, that we reach out to the neighborhood, in the very earliest phases of the work, and certainly even at those times we can already begin to present some visual representations, etc. But yes, I agree that that's a really vital part of a process for approval of any project, is that the developer and their consultants should be reaching out to the neighborhoods, giving them early notice and discussing and getting early feedback so that we can avoid controversies down the road to the greatest extent possible anyway.
Mr. Dominguez?
On that last note, I think the community, and you've heard a lot of it here today, and I've heard a lot of it because this project and most of the projects that we've talked about with AUD are in my district. The community is really upset. They feel they haven't had a voice. They feel that they're suffering all the social harms and they're not sharing in any of the benefits. This is a so-called affordable housing program. None of it's shown up as affordable. And so when you talk about notice, we finally got around last week as a council to addressing notice for tenants. So it really makes me pause when I hear people talking about outreach to tenants in this neighborhood. And someone brought up the point that they don't rely on technology like you and I do. And putting something on site is crucial. And it's unfortunate that the community here hasn't done that voluntarily, not necessarily even 4x8 signs,
do you have a
but smaller
question for
signs.
Mr.
I'm
Pecker?
leading up to the question.
Please do.
The house next to mine has been under development for a year and a half, and it's got a broken yellow sign that the number washed off right away, and now it's torn in half and just laying there. It's really horrible. So my question is, the picture you showed us of Milpas, it didn't really show some of the neighboring blocks. So I'm wondering how the technology would give you more of a sense that you're there in presence, because I think the gold standard is that we have an engaged community that's walking around the neighborhood and commenting and talking about the value of the projects that we're adding, or in the worst case scenario, some of the drawbacks of the projects. So looking at pictures isolated on your iPad at home isn't nearly as good as people being able to walk around and talk about it. Several community groups have walks. So how would the technology show, like a block away you have a street where there's only one structure on it, and it's an old one-story building?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, the technology can certainly be extended well beyond simply creating photo simulation still images. I can show you, and I'd be happy to send you a link to a couple of the kinds of simulations that we've done that show the entire, like a kind of walk around, fly over, whatever you do. Once you have that three-dimensional model, which is pretty routinely developed as part of any architectural design process these days, we can push that and extend it out to doing photorealistic drive-bys, walk-arounds. You can create a model that can be interactive in different ways. I think it really depends on the circumstances and how how important it is to, push beyond just simple photo simulations. But I think that's a kind of decision that can be left to your design review board to decide whether something that extends beyond just photo simulation images is necessary. It can certainly be done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ellen Bildstein, and the final speaker will be Natasha.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and council members. As an architect in town and representative of the advocacy group for the AIA in Santa Barbara, I just wanted to also just add a few extra bits to what primarily Brian Kernell and Detty Pikert have said already. The technology that they've demonstrated in the images that they've shown is standard. Every architecture firm that's doing projects of any significant size is using that technology. The merging of a photograph with those 3D models that we're already creating adds very little cost to the applicant, and I think is, as was demonstrated, is a really effective way to show exactly how the architecture, not just the height of the buildings that we design, but the architecture can impact the neighborhood. I think that's another whole aspect to what these renderings will assist with visualizing, aside from just simplifying it down to what is the height of the structure, but also what is the look that will be contributed to the neighborhood. I think the time factor that allows the public to see what is being proposed is significant. There are some real problems inherent in story poles. You cannot leave them up for very long at all. They become a hazard. They're structurally very unstable, and you cannot leave them up for longer than a few days. So the proposal to keep them up for weeks or a month becomes a liability and a danger to the community as opposed to an asset. These renderings could be posted online and left there for weeks, months, however long the city decides is the appropriate time for the public to have an opportunity to take a look at them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Natasha?
Wow, this is fun. Virtual reality. That is cool. You know, my brother's got this virtual reality machine. It's like this big, and you've got to put goggles on people. So that means the entire East Side is going to get virtual reality goggles. This is going to be so cool. Look, we're trying to do the story polls for a couple of things. We're trying to do notification. We talked about notification last week. You found it important. You wanted to expand it. The story polls notify the neighborhood about what's going on. 7-Eleven went up on our corner. We didn't even know what was going on until the construction started. And we're informed, we're engaged, we look at stuff, but we missed that. So imagine if you're one of my neighbors driving down the street and you see this story pole thing, and you don't know what it means, and you don't know how to get engaged, and you're busy from 7 in the morning until 6 or 8 at night, and you can't get down to the Planning Commission, you can't figure out what's going on. Are we going to get engagement? And part of the story poll thing is getting engagement from the community, because these are decisions that impact a lot of people. So if it's impacting somebody, don't they have a right to know? Don't we want them to know? So if we pass this, let me ask you, who is it going to be applied to specifically? When is it going to be applied? Have we thought this out? I'm in favor of the story polls, because if we don't model things for people, if we don't show it concretely, how it's going to impact them, what it's going to look like in the community, then it's just this kind of fuzzy-wuzzy thing that might happen, and we don't know who it's for or what it's going to be. So please, vote to put in the story polls. Please vote to put them in for a sufficient length of time so people can notice, so they can understand what to do, and so that they can act upon that before they're impacted after the fact.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that concludes public comment. It's did you have a question? It's to the council. Just a quick question first. What is typical in terms of the length of time story poles go up?
Madam Mayor and council members, our current policy is that they be installed on a Friday before a site visit. And with respect to Planning Commission and Staff Hearing Officer, those bodies do their site visits on Tuesday mornings. So it's usually Friday to Tuesday morning. And I believe we use a similar length of time when ABR HLC asks for story poles. ABR meets on Monday. I'm not sure if they put their poles up Friday or Thursday, but usually over a weekend.
Is there always a photo of the site with the story poles up for the record, or no?
Yes, maybe you can clarify the question.
So story poles go up for a few days.
Yes.
Does someone take a photo of it
Yes.
with the poles up so they come down? And if you want to see them again, you
Yes.
have an opportunity to
Yes,
see the
we do,
picture
Madam
with the story
Mayor.
poles.
We require that the poles, first of all, be delineated and noted on a story pole plan by either an architect or surveyor to ensure that they're put in the right place at the right height. And then photos are required that they be taken of the photo, or they be taken of the poles and submitted to planning staff. We also have to approve the story pole plan before they're actually installed to make sure that they're highlighting the right aspects of the building.
Okay, thank you. All right, so it's to the council, Mr. Hart.
Who was it? Okay, thank you. Well, I think this has been a really interesting discussion because it's much broader than I had initially anticipated, thinking about this. And the public have made some really interesting points about wanting to be more involved earlier on in the process. And, the idea that we can use our our regular noticing process more effectively and have more information connected this isn't black and white. This is all shades of gray. We could have a requirement that city staff go knock on every door in a neighborhood and bring plans with them and have a 15-minute conversation with everybody that they talk to about a project. We could go as extreme as we want to do this, and we try to figure out the natural, reasonable, being aggressive and letting people know about things, but not spending too much money and time and resources on doing that. And so finding the sweet spot is the challenge here. And one idea is to use the old technology that very simply says, here's a box and here's what's going to be built. And that helps people who are driving by to see that and know that, but it doesn't provide much information really about that other than that. And it's expensive and it's dangerous to keep it up, or it costs more to keep it up. There's the tension between building a structure to last or building something to be there for a little bit of time. I think it's interesting that this wasn't driven by the design review boards, and they're concerned about this because I think these are professionals who are looking at these things and they know how to use these tools and they know how to interpret them, and they're doing it on a daily basis, so they understand how to put these things in context. So we have really a communication problem with the public, and I am struck by the fact that our new software technologies can make it easier to notify tenants, and I don't know enough about what else it might be able to do. But having active live links to this extra information through that process is a really powerful tool, and I don't know if that's easy to do, and if we can make that happen. And it sounds like maybe we need to get more information from staff about other options to do this, because to me, it isn't as simple as just we're solving the problem by putting up story poles and requiring them under these specific things, because I think there's always going to be other examples where people would have said, well, you should have done it there, not then. And we never win in that kind of conversation. So I'm intrigued by a bigger, broader conversation about this. I don't think we have information from staff to make a decision today about it.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, going back to my personal desire to see fewer and fewer appeals in this room once projects are approved and going up or wherever, but also applying the technology that we do have today. As I looked at some of Mr. Cornell's exhibits and showed the story poles and the ribbons and the flags versus the renderings that are available now through CAD or whatever kinds of technology we do have. What I'd like to see us do is enhance those kind of artistic interpretations, but accurately for the public, and maybe as proposed on a big 4x8 poster, to give it that same kind of public notice that maybe those flags and poles would give that are frankly a little bit abstract, and this would probably bring it a little bit more to reality. I'm sure that we've all experienced the who the hell approved that phenomena when something goes up. Law and Trot et al. And you know, those had a ton of story poles and things like that went up over time. It's hard. It's hard to even see modeling and really understand what how the abstract fits into the final. But if the requirements were done correctly for the renderings that could show all of the angles, all the perspectives, the overview of the neighborhood, and my big concern is that these projects are standalone and they don't actually concern outside of the neighborhood when it comes to things like traffic and circulation, which is a different story altogether. But in terms of mountain views, in terms of views towards the Riviera, in terms of even views down towards the ocean, what is this going to do to it? And does the story pole accurately reflect that? Or do we have the technology today to make a better, more accurate picture? And I'd like to see us expand on that. And then I think even Mr. Piker said that in some cases story poles may still be needed. And that's fine. We still should leave that discretion in. But I think working on the requirement to give a better, accurate, artistic view, something that isn't just a watercolor rendering, but we can actually do it so it's got the accurate angles and the accurate measurements in it, may actually be a superior way of informing the public. Because I do think, I'll disagree with Mr. Cornell, I do think that the public noticing is really important. I think it is the public that needs to know more than even the ABR and the HLC. They need to know what's going on in their neighborhood. So I'd like to see us enhance that and move towards getting better public pictures on what is coming in their neighborhood.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I appreciate the discussion. I appreciate staff bringing this forward, and our design review boards chiming in, as well as the architects that have taken time out to show up today. I'd like to first of all, let's go back to the AUD. The AUD was promulgated as an experiment and as a change in order to get some housing, to provide some kind of less unaffordable housing from as compared to the variable density ordinance, which was on the books before, that stimulated mansionized condos. And we are seeing, obviously, that we're seeing success in terms of at least we have rental housing coming in. Mr. Dominguez raised a concern about what those prices are tending to be. I would argue that at least we're seeing just the fact that it's rental is a step in the right direction, and I do appreciate that part of it is a success. And I have one slide that I want to show in a minute that is actually not an affordable project. Wait a second. I'll just keep on the list on that other one for the minute. Yeah, go back to that what you had there was just right for now. And I know as this effort got going, I supported a couple of projects that were appealed to council. And in each case, because I believe so strongly in the that we have behind us this team of experts, the ABR, the HLC, Planning Commission, that they need to be there needs to be a strong reason not to go along with them when projects are appealed to us. I've opposed the project on Upper Castillo Street, where I thought parking was out of whack, and I know that conversation continues on with all of us. That project went forward. but I hope that at least my opposition has stimulated that conversation more as we're going along. I supported two projects, the Peter Lewis project on Cannon, Perdido, and Olive, and double appeal the People's Self-Help Project on Haley and Salsipuedes, or Cesar Chavez. And I would say that the People's Self-Help Project is the canary in my mind at this point, And I appreciate that we have Mr. Piker here to participate in this. Should the conversation widen? And I'm curious to know, and this would be a good time then now to put that photo up. As I've watched, as this project has gone up, we're looking from the southwest corner of Haley to the northeast corner where the project is, as it's going up today. I took that on the way in today, and this project goes from Haley Street to Coda Street, so it goes literally the full north-south, as it were, distance of Cesar Chavez, and it blocks out the mountain view. My take is that this project could have had the same square footage, the same number of units, and not have blocked out as much mountain view. And I think Story Poles would have told us that. One question of staff is, would what you're proposing today as a solution or as a step, would that have picked up Story Poles on this project? It's a pop quiz a little bit, and if it's, I don't want to grind on it too hard, but
no, that's fine. Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, I believe it would have hit the threshold of a 3-story building without one within 300 feet, but I could be wrong if someone knows of another 3-story building at that point. Okay. There is a 3-story building proposed directly north of this, as you pointed out, but it wasn't in existence at the time that this project was going through.
So this is, as I say, this is one of my canaries, and it just says, I support the concept of this project. I support the total the unit count on this project. I just think it could have been more compatible with our values and our community than what we're receiving. So that's as I've struggled with continuing to nurture AUD. I know that I've created some discomfort around what I thought we were going to be able to do around compatibility and around around compatibility. That's what's the other term I'm looking for? The adaptive management. I had imagined that we would have more flexibility on parking and on other issues using those tools which are embedded in the general plan. So I'm worried about AUD staying in compatibility mode. That's the driver for my talking about Story Poles today. I appreciate that our designer friends have talked about the electronic potentials here. We did not get those electronic potentials with this project. It came to us twice. And we did not pick up on this issue, which maybe my views don't prevail with this group, or maybe they do, but at least that is what drove the need to be as compatible as possible with AUD projects will allow AUD to keep on going long term. And if we blow it, the reaction will be strong enough so that we're not going to keep it going. We go back to being variable density if we don't. We're going to have to make. There's going to be five. There needs to be 5 votes up here that say we're going to continue to do AUD, and we're not going to go back to variable density. That's how the whole thing is structured now. So we need to make sure we have 5 votes up here saying AUD is continuing to be a good idea, and all the regulations and guidelines that we're using are good enough. The photo sims, I appreciate. I think that, again, as our professionals hear about this and find ways to circulate them, all the better. I am a fan of story polls, obviously, and I'm looking for ways to be judicious with them. I think the comments about how long they're up, we've had a good dialogue there. Some people saying, let's have them up for a long time, and the professionals saying, we can't put them up for a long time. Not only are they, and I happen to, having experienced story polls, I believe that they can't be up for a long time. I think the photos that are taken of them helps over the long term. But often, in some cases, in the commercial and downtown areas, story polls will actually interfere with the property being used the next day. There actually are businesses that have had to be shut down while the story polls are up because they are that unsafe. So I think that Thursday, Friday to Monday, Tuesday is a reasonable approach to story polls if we have the votes up here to move forward. I also think that staff has tried to respond with sculpting this in a way that's not overreaching and coming up with specifics. And I appreciate that if it does cover this particular piece of the puzzle, that assuages my concerns. So I'm hearing a range of views up here so far, but I think that this is a good approach to nurturing AUD and having it have a good shot at staying viable past the 250 unit completion ingredient.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, we're just voting on story polls here, right?
That's right.
Okay, I got confused there for a minute. Well, I'd like to have my cake and eat it, too. I agree with Natasha that putting story polls up does bring awareness that otherwise is not going to happen. But I also think that this 21st century simulation is pretty powerful stuff, and we ought to do that also. So I would like to have both as part of the mix, remembering that public awareness is what we're after. Therefore, any way we can go after that or pursue that or allow it would be better. I realize this is going to add some expense to the development, but we're trying to preserve a special city, and we ought to take every step to do that. Thank you.
Ms. Murillo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to thank the public who came out to talk about this. I agree with you, Councilmember Hotchkiss. Engaging the public is important. This is their neighborhoods. But I was persuaded by Mr. Graydon and Mr. Lavoie coming up and talking to us. They're thoughtful, experienced professionals who are perfectly capable of saying when story polls are necessary. We get them sometimes now when those bodies look at the projects. And I know that separate from this discussion, planning staff is working on design review guidelines, right? And so the design review boards are going to be given a whole new set of tools and an opportunity to decide when story polls are necessary. So I'm going to trust them when they want those story polls to go up. So I'm leaning toward the status quo, even though this is fabulous work, Ms. Brooke, what you've done here, looking at all these different variables. And Mr. Councilmember White's photo also showed us the question about mountain views, and had we asked for 3 different perspectives with the mountain view in mind, or ocean view, right, whatever it is that we're trying to protect, maybe there would have been some changes to that project, and we didn't have to do it with story polls. We could have done it with the 3D technology. So that would have corrected that problem as far as I'm concerned. Adding costs to housing projects, I attended the Economic Vitality team of Santa Barbara's workshop a couple of weeks ago. That's our new Economic Development Collaborative in Santa Barbara County. It was in Buellton. Elected officials from all over the county. They talked about the need for workforce housing. There's been some mention today about the need for affordable housing. Right, that's what our housing authority does. The business community, our large employers in Santa Barbara County and the city of Santa Barbara, they're looking for that workforce housing, exactly what the AUD is going to build. So I just need to say that if somebody's talking about the affordability, please hear me relaying to you what the business community was saying just a couple of weeks ago. And Nina Johnson and I were there, and no one else was there to hear that, so I'm bringing it back. I'm satisfied with the giant sign on the curb. District elections is bringing us a neighborhood-focused kind of leadership. It's up to our council members to communicate to their neighborhood associations. So if I balance the cost, because story poles that are sturdy enough to stay up there for a long time are going to cost more money. We have to balance the cost with noticing. So I'll be voting for the status quo, Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dominguez?
I have a few questions. The Section 1, projects with 4 stories located outside of El Pueblo Viejo. So does that mean 4 stories in EPV won't be subject to story poles?
Madam Mayor and Councilmember Dominguez, as drafted, the threshold would not mandate that story poles be constructed for a 4-story project proposed in EPV, but HLC could opt to require them under their discretion if they wanted.
How much does the 4-story area in Santa Barbara overlap with EPV? In other words, how much area is there outside of EPV that's 4-story?
The other primary area is Upper State Street and Haley, the CM zoned parcels.
Okay.
Could potentially allow, yeah.
Thank you. On number C, it brings to mind a question I've seen at some of the boards and commissions lately where 3-story buildings do not currently exist. It seemed like there was some discussion of what constitutes a 3-story building, whether you take into account topography. So in this situation, are we using the strict definition of 3-story?
We have in the zoning ordinance a definition for how building height and stories are calculated, so I propose that we would use that definition.
Okay. And then finally in Section 2, Part C, the proposed structures will not involve blockage or substantial reduction. Is there a difference between the two? Would substantial reduction include blockage?
Councilmember Dominguez, that's subjective terminology based as proposed here, based on HLC or ABR's interpretation of whether they can say a project will not involve blockage or substantial reduction. It could be just that it doesn't even, the project isn't even proposed in a view shed that is a public scenic view. That's the safest way to say that that finding could be made to exempt story poles.
And public scenic view, is that a view that the private households or other households have of a public view? Or what does the public part mean here?
In this context, it means a view that is available for the public to view, and it needs to be a significant viewpoint. It's not at any place that the public could have a view, but that it's a significant, it's a gathering place, it's a public park, or somehow other. I think we have a. Okay, go ahead.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, the public scenic view, the focus there is on from a public location. Ms. Brooke was getting to that point, but it talks about a public view from a public location. A sidewalk is a common public view, but I would submit that in general, while sidewalks are public locations, not every corner on the street is a significant public view. It deals with where people are gathering. In the case of the Entrada project, there were specific viewpoints that were identified as being more important than other public viewpoints, and that analysis factored into how that project was ultimately approved.
I'm sorry I missed that debate. So the example Mr. White raised about South Sea Puedes and Haley, so people biking or walking up Haley or standing on Haley, would that constitute an important public scenic view, the loss of the mountain view?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, that is a public view from an intersection. I'm not sure that it would be one that would be characterized as an important public scenic view, as we typically tend to think of them, which would be to or from the beach, looking towards the mountains, or as I mentioned, public gathering spaces, parks, where there's a wider expanse of open space where you really get a vista of an important scenic aspect of the city.
And the reason I'm trying to hone in on this is a pretty long phrase, and if these guidelines are supposed to add usefulness to the boards and commissions so that they can apply these more easily, I want to make sure we're not adding in more vague terms that will extend their debate rather than provide them and the applicants and developers with guidance. So I'm just curious, but it seems like possibly there's no way around this if public scenic view is not defined in the zoning code.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, as you're seeing from this discussion, an important public scenic view has so many factors in it. The definition would be extremely difficult to define and to write out. To give an illustration of what Ms. Brooke was mentioning, in the case of Entrada again, the southwest corner of Cabrillo and State Street, next to the Dolphin Fountain, was determined to be an important public scenic view. The southwest corner of Mason and State Street was not determined to be an important public scenic view, if that helps and gives you some context.
It does. So I guess the way I approach this is I don't want any individual business developer to have to spend any more money than they need to reach a goal. And the goal here is for the public to be aware of what's being built and have a discussion, and for boards and commissions and in cases where things go wrong, the council to be able to weigh in on a decision. So it seems like we may have reached a balance because no one's really happy. Allied and some of the speakers today want more, and some of the architects and development community want less, so we may have reached a compromise that may work. I like the idea of adding in technology and harnessing that. Again, it's not a complete solution because particularly the communities within the AUD area, which is all we're focusing on in this discussion, are on the wrong side of the digital divide, and we haven't done enough to correct it. Our website doesn't have information for them, even if they were to want to tune in and find out. So I think we really want to keep this out in the community space. This isn't overreaching also because not only is it limited to the AUD area, it's limited to buildings that are 3 or more stories, if I understand it correctly. Is that correct? It's not going to reach down to 2 stories or fewer?
Councilmember Dominguez, it could, if looking at this slide here, the 4th bullet in the AUD project within 150 feet of a designated historic resource is up there regardless of the building size. The 5th bullet likely would have multiple stories. If it's a project that is requiring Planning Commission comments, that has to be on a site that's 15,000 square feet or more, and in the high density or priority housing overlay. So those are the bigger projects we're seeing.
And if it was subject to D, then there's the A, B, C, D, and E of Part 2, which could take it out of that requirement if it was a 2-story or fewer buildings. So I think there's a lot there. So I think there's enough safeguards. I think there's enough limitations here to go to the goal of the AUD. You know, it sounds like Ms. Maria and I respectfully disagree with each other about the goal of AUD and the story poles. We both agree we need more housing and it has to be affordable. The problem is it's not workforce housing, which the ULI defines as 60 to 120%. And what this is building is 150 to 200% of median income. So we're really helping the 25% of the richest tenants in Santa Barbara. This is not what the Vitality Group talked about when they talked about workforce housing, because our own data says we are expecting 3,000 median and below income jobs to be added, and this is not the housing that's going to meet that goal. Because there's no inclusionary housing as part of this, it's coming in at the top of the market. The latest study in California shows that infill housing goes at a 66% premium, 66% above the average housing price in a community. So to expect that this is going to come in where minimum wage workers can expect it, when everywhere else it's 66%, and even the buildings that are about to open are showing that their prices are way above that threshold, is something that we need to keep the conversation going about. So I would support this and add in the technological add-ons that some of the architects mentioned today. And I would also, being encouraged by several of the members up here talking about technology and wanting people to have access to more engagement technology, I would also make a further motion after this is concluded, since Excella is our vendor for the project we voted on earlier, that we look at bringing them back to do a public engagement technology. One of the quotes I saw for them was for $5,000. They have a Fresgo for the city of Fresno. It's a website that allows the public to engage via smartphone, and it was only $5,000. So it's something I'll bring back after this is concluded.
Okay, so well, first off, thank you everyone for it was actually quite an excellent, good conversation about a complex issue that keeps coming up, even though it seems so simple to say, do we want story poles up in certain projects or not? I'm waiting for the holodeck that everyone can just walk into and see everything. We're not quite there yet. So live long and prosper in the meantime. But I think, and I agree with everyone that some form of getting into 21st century information on the website that's easily accessible to everyone is where we want to end up. And so I think in the meantime, this is worth doing to help the notification period in the neighborhood involvement section. I have complete faith and confidence in the professional side of the process. I think we've said loud and clear to our design review boards, and they keep hearing it, that it's okay, in fact encouraged, if you have any inkling to require story poles to do so. And and they're starting to do so, and I think this resolution also now says, well, we've actually went through this in much detail, and we think some areas could be exempt. It is a good balancing act. Once we get this technology in place, it would be very easy on any given Tuesday for 4 members of council to rescind this resolution. And but until then, I think what's missing in this balancing act is some notification to the general public who aren't in the day-to-day activity of checking agendas and so forth, that hopefully they can be by virtue of seeing something like story poles up there. And and if we can get to a point in the near future where through other signage or notification or renderings or whatever it is, then we can reduce the regulation and rescind this resolution. But until then, I think it's important that we keep that conversation going. So I'm fine with this resolution. I appreciate what Allied and others were saying about long time story poles in the intent there, but I agree with the architects and others involved that, and comments up here, that that might be an undue burden on the project, and perhaps not really getting what's necessary, especially if we have a photo rendition of the project after the story poles are up. So I'm inclined to vote for this as it stands, and I think we have some more lights on. So, Ms. Murillo, you were first with the new light on, so go right ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd just like to, as I acknowledge the presence of East Side residents here, and there is a digital divide in terms of some of our residents in the lower income brackets, that people on the East Side do have computers and access to the internet. So if we are going into that direction, there will be a way for those folks to access the the renderings that we're contemplating putting up there. And second, when we have our discussion about the AUD, we will talk about affordability, and it's just irresponsible to make assumptions about what all the units are going to rent for now, and not acknowledge that we really need more rental units. Thank you, Councilmember White, for starting out your comments talking about how useful this program has been. I cannot support this, as I said, and I'm thinking about making a motion to stay with the status quo, but I don't believe in acts of futility, so I will stand by for what is coming next. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, we as council asked staff to look into this and look at story polls, and they were very responsive to it. However, now that I look at this, and we're talking about story polls versus technology. I'm not talking about technology. Mr. Cornell talked about 4x8 boards. That's not technology. That could be as much public notice, if not better, than story polls. Something that goes up and stays up for 4 to 5 days, goes up on a Friday and comes down on a Tuesday, may miss quite a bit of the population, whereas the 4x8 boards with the different perspectives of the project may be up for the duration of the project itself. So I agree with the folks, especially the folks on the east side. They're very, very concerned about these projects going in and get enough public notice. What's the proper way to do it? And that's my thing. I'm going to go back to Mr. Hotchkiss and his cake and eat it too. I think we could have I think we're asking the wrong question here, or the wrong resolution. I think we should be looking at developing the requirements for the kind of renderings that show perspectives from all angles, show correct height, so we can put up virtual story polls for that matter. But you can fill them in with the artistic rendering, or not the artistic rendering, the actual CAD drawing, and get a much better, cleaner way for the average Joe like myself to understand, without it being real abstract, what the project's going to look like and what it's going to do to the different views. But I think they have to be big. I think they have to be the 4x8 that was suggested before. I think they have to be on all corners of the project. However we do this, that's what I'd rather see than going back to this 4 or 5 day duration of putting up the poles that may be expensive and may not be easy to maintain. So I would like to direct it that. I would like to not support this resolution and to go in that different direction as instruction to staff to come back.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I think that the board, the 4x8 board concept, I think I saw it in the city of Vancouver, and they do great big signs that show development. So that may be one template to look at and just see what they're doing. And of course, we have creative ideas coming forward on that too. I certainly am supportive of that idea as well. I think for the time being, however, I want to continue to pursue the story pole alternative and see how we do on that. So I will make a motion to approve the resolution as outlined by staff with the specifics there. I know we have one question about Mr. Gradine's comment, but
sure. But do we have a second?
We can wait on that. Yeah.
I'd second it with the hopefully the addition of talking about the enhancement of whatever renderings you want to call it, making them available, as the mayor pointed out. Is that in accordance with your?
That's fine.
Okay, and then that's the second.
Okay, and it's with the correction. I know make section 4 section 4. Can we clarify the motion then? If it's the resolution as presented plus
the 21st century enhancements.
What does that mean?
Those are the ones that we looked at and where we could see real good projection of how things could look, and people can access those easily online through their own URL, not just through the city page.
Okay, let's try to translate that into what that means into actual implementation. So I just want to ask staff. You just heard what Mr. Hotchkiss says. How does that translate into what it is that you would have to do?
Thank you, Madam Mayor and council members. You might be aware that we're also working right now on two other fronts related to ABR and HLC review of larger projects, and that is infill design guidelines, which will eventually be coming to council in a couple of months for your consideration, as well as augmenting our design review submittal requirements, so the materials that applicants must present to staff and the design review boards. And Jaime Limon is getting very close to wrapping that up, including enhanced renderings, additional perspectives. So I think it would be more appropriate to try to wrap that into submittal requirements versus an aspect of this resolution. And then to the extent that we can try to have some of that information available online, we can do that. I'm just not sure the timing and how much and how consistently we can do that right now with the technology we have. So I'm certainly willing to do what we can if it's worded as maybe a separate motion direction to council to explore and do to the best of our ability that kind of direction.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the what I'm getting from staff's feedback is we separate this out. It goes forward because there are a couple of efforts underway where this could be folded in, and it would not be as easily folded into this effort. So I would support that 21st century as a second motion here. So then.
Okay, so we're back to the original motion of just the resolution, and then I'm going to go back to you, Mr. White, afterwards or maybe Mr. Hotchkiss for a separate motion on the future. Okay. Mr. Hart.
I prefer Councilmember Rouse's approach. I think the large sign is really the best compromise. The HLC and the ABR both have at their own discretion the ability to require story poles where they're needed. Having a blanket requirement is unnecessarily onerous, and I think that Councilmember Rouse's idea about having the signs at the sites is a simpler, common sense, understandable approach to give people notification for them to see more information in that rendering on that sign than story poles going up for 3 days.
Okay. Does there need to be any council direction to put up the sign that has been described? Is there something in our sign ordinance or anything like that, or can that just happen?
Madam Mayor,
yes.
Members of the council, if you're talking about the 4x8
yes.
sign, Mr. Canal, we'd want to accommodate that in the ordinance. So I don't think you need to take any action now, but we will recognize government and public agency signs in the ordinance, and we'll make some mention of size.
In the upcoming sign updates
Correct.
that you're working on right now.
Correct.
Okay, so that will be in process as part of the process you're working on separately.
Yes, and I was going to keep silent because I think you got it right, but it would be very difficult to amend the resolution with direction today, so doing the motion separately is a lot safer for us than trying to put together what you really did later.
Okay. All right. So we have a motion for just the resolution. We will have another motion on other items about direction to staff on future processes of notification and renderings. I'll go back to just what I said. I appreciate the comments up here, but I think once that's set, we can very easily undo this resolution. But so to me, this is a temporary measure, because we don't know how long it's going to take before we really get the type of things we're looking for. So, but once it happens, it can go back. So, Ms. Murillo, your light's on, and then Mr. Dominguez.
Oh, I was going to ask whether the project developer would be required to do both story poles and the big sign. I hope it's one or the other. That sounds like a double cost, but I'll leave that to the people working out the details. But
okay.
Yeah, I'm with Councilmember Hart and Rouse on this. I don't dislike these ideas. I'm just going to stand my ground that I trust the ABR and HLC professionals to do their job. So I'll be voting no, Madam Mayor.
Okay,
Thank you.
Mr. Dominguez.
One last comment. The thing that really pushes me to believe this is balanced is in Section 2, the two comments A and B. They won't be required to have story poles if the proposed structures are clearly consistent in terms of size, bulk, and scale with other buildings in the surrounding neighborhood, or the proposed structure is the same height as or smaller than existing buildings in the neighborhood. So this really isn't about buildings where there's a tie or they're similar. It's really where there's buildings that are bigger in scale. So it really reduces it to that narrow universe of buildings that people are really concerned about. So this isn't just your mom and pop developer. So for people who are listening and aren't really clear on that, this really goes to buildings that there's been a determination that they're already bigger than all the other buildings around, and they're bigger than, in most cases, 3 stories. So that's pushed me to this determination.
Okay, we have a motion for the resolution and a split vote I foresee. So if we can have a roll call, please.
Councilmember Hotchkiss?
Yes.
Councilmember White?
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Dominguez?
Aye.
Councilmember Rouse?
No.
Councilmember Hart?
No.
Councilmember Maria?
No.
And Mayor Schneider?
Aye. That passes 4-3 with Rouse, Hart, and Maria saying no. Okay, Mr. White, do we have another motion?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I move that council resolve to that council instructs staff to fold into the other work efforts the use of renderings and what other term would we use? Modern simulations into the application process, such that those would be available for public view during the application process. Does that cover it?
Yeah. If I may add just one thing to that. Denny Pikert brought up a good point of not having to go through 3 or 4 levels of access, but having a button that would take you directly to whatever the simulations or whatever we're calling them. So that's why I suggest a URL. But if that could be at least kept at utmost in your mind as you proceed with this. And that's so it is a second.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So to this motion, Mr. Rouse?
Question for the maker of the motion. Can that include on-site renderings as well? Because we keep talking about technology, and what we really want to get is the public at large man on the street. So can we amend that to on-site as well?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'll support that.
And second.
Okay. Any other questions to the motion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that's unanimous. All right. Mr. Did you want to? Oh, yeah. Did you have something?
So I wanted to add a motion to see if I can get support to bring back to the council at a later date from staff a report on public engagement software, either by Excella or one of the other players in the field that deal with public engagement for both public development, public works and community development.
Okay, is there a second for that? I mean, I'll second it just for, I mean, I think that's already in process. Or Mr. Casey, what?
Well, Madam Mayor, I'm not sure exactly what Councilmember Dominguez is requesting. There's something called Citizen Relationship Management, called CRM, where people can submit pothole requests and other kind of citizen complaint information from a mobile phone. And I think that might be what you're talking about.
And the one I'm talking about that people could look to is Fresgo. It's the City of Fresno's app, and it's when I talked to the developer at a conference, they said it would be about $5,000 for a city our size. So it's very inexpensive in terms of the direct cost of the budget. I know there's manpower costs in terms of implementing it. That's why I would want to bring it back.
All due respect, I would be careful on what you're being suggested at conferences by vendors about how much it costs. We've looked at this before. It's an evolving technology. It's interesting. I might suggest that I'll have administrative services and our information technology. Maybe we're just a couple months away from their budget presentation, kind of bring back that as a discussion point. We've got a lot on their plate for kind of software that they're already working on. It's something we've looked about. We can fill council in about our thoughts and get guidance and direction
Yeah,
as part of that.
and I don't think we want in the motion just to distinguish one particular vendor and one particular software. It's the concept of using application software for community engagement. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what you're suggesting is that could be part of the administrative services budget discussion?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm willing to amend the motion to make that the spot where
Well,
you
just
bring
to
it
come
back
back at a future meeting,
Yeah,
which it
or-
could be flexible that way.
I don't need a motion. If there's an interest in having a conversation about that, I'll just do that.
That's
as
not
part
on
of that
today's
budget.
agenda. I don't know how we can talk about this.
Okay. Well, there's a suggestion that I think can work out just fine. So we don't need a motion on that. Okay. Anything else on this item? All right. So let's take a quick break. When that clock hits 4:30, we'll get to item 10. Thanks.
For reimbursement of increased desalination plant costs, and one for the construction of a water desalination conveyance pipeline.
Thank you, Mr. Hagmark.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, council members. Joshua Hagmark, Water Resources Manager. Here today to just walk you through two resolutions that are before you, seeking to pursue a loan amendment and a new loan. As part of the discussion today, I just want to give a little quick background on what SRF loans are. Just quickly touch on the amendment for the desal reactivation and expansion. We talked extensively about that on January 10th. Provide a little more detail, though, on the loan for desal conveyance pipeline, general schedule for the loan if we were to pursue that, and then the recommendation. So SRF loans is a joint venture between the feds and the state, recognizing the need for water agencies to be able to continue to invest in their water infrastructure. It was structured as a revolving fund loan. Basically, as we start to repay, that money get to turn around and lend that money out again. As you know, there's a lot of needs in Santa Barbara and in the nation for SRF funding. And in particular, the city has taken advantage of it on many occasions, most recently with the Cater Ozone Project. But it's also been instrumental with the desal project. Generally, the terms are 20 years, and every year they come out with a new interest rate. I wanted to clarify on bullet number 3. It doesn't. Once you locked in, it does not change. But every year they come out with a new interest rate. In January, I think it's 1.7% on any new loans. Because we're doing an amendment, it would be on the same terms of the original agreement, which was 1.66% interest. So on the new loan, if we were to pursue the conveyance loan, that would be at the 1.7% interest rate. Typically, it takes about a year to get a loan. We've been in discussions with the state staff, and they believe that we could expedite because we just recently got a loan. They have a lot of our documentation. They think we can turn around this conveyance pipeline loan in a shorter turnaround time, and so we'll see if that is indeed true. And then a general amendment takes about 6 months. It's an incredibly long process. So the loan amendment for desal reactivation, we're looking to secure funding to cover the construction cost increases that we talked about on January 10th. The amount anticipated is $71 million. While we are amending the loan and knowing that it takes 6 months to do that, we thought it prudent to also at the same time secure funding for a potential expansion of the desal plant. At this time, and the assumed expansion would be 7,500. I think that's about as much as we're anticipating doing in the foreseeable future, and at a cost of approximately $35 million. Those are rough numbers at this point. Seeking to secure access to up to $106 million. That would be the total amount. So we're talking about a minimum loan amount to reflect the current $71 million approved by council. The $106 represents a maximum funds the city might reasonably consider. It does not represent a required commitment by the city at this time. So the desal conveyance pipeline, something we've kind of touched upon. Authorization was given in August to begin preliminary design work on this. We are now working into final design. The pipeline is basically essential to being able to move desal water regionally. And as we've been talking about a potential deal with Montecito, this is the essential piece of pipe that will make that happen. I'll be showing a little graphic that shows where it goes, but it does provide some city water quality benefits. One of the issues with desal water is it depends on the time of year as to how far out into the system it will go. And so being able to tie into this transmission main allows us to blend that water so that customers are seeing more of a consistent water quality year-round. The pipe alignment could support future potable reuse. We did look into this alignment. One of the things we wanted to look at is, is this getting us to potentially some future goals that we might have? And we would have to do additional piping to make that happen, and that would be taking the potable reuse water up to Laurel. But this alignment, this pipeline could be utilized for that should we get to that point. The conveyance pipeline is required if we expand the plant. Conveyance pipeline road required is not required if we do not expand the plant and if we do not enter into a water supply agreement. Our current design does not require this conveyance pipeline. So this would be something that I think we would only entertain if we were expanding the plant or entering into an agreement to sell desal water regionally. The general alignment for this, it's approximately 15,000 linear feet. Starting down here at the desal plant on Yananali Street, it would go up to Calle Cesar Chavez, up Calle Cesar Chavez to Ortega. In this area here, we're currently doing investigation for contaminated soils. This area has a history of contaminated soils, and so we are conducting an assessment of that. We do believe once we get up to Ortega, there has been better behavior in the past, and so we anticipate the chances of contaminated soil will probably decrease, likely more of just boulders and rocks is what we'll find in this area. But we go up Olive to Sola, jog over Sola to Garden, and then right now they're still contemplating the connection here into Mission. Mission Street is where we have an existing 24-inch steel line that was put in the 50s. That line goes all the way back up to Cater. And that's where we tie in and basically allow us to push that water up and, in essence, convey that water anywhere in the city and regionally. The proposed method of construction is called open cut construction. It's pretty much what we consider typical construction. Our local contractors, this is something they would be apt to go after. It doesn't require any special tools to do this. The size of the pipeline that we're anticipating is about a 24-inch pipeline. That would give us the capacity to move around 10,000 acre-feet a year out of the low zone. The preliminary cost estimate is right now $12 million. And again, we're still in preliminary. I think this number could be on the high side, but I think for our planning purposes at this time, we're just asking for a loan, and then we can always adjust it based on the actual cost. The construction duration is somewhere between 12 and 16 months, and that will get further refined as we get through final design. The schedule for this, for the loans, however, is to try and get this process initiated. If the resolutions are passed today, we would move forward with submitting the initial loan documents. We anticipate April to July. We'll be working with SRF loan staff as they review the loan. And then in August, that's currently our timeline for adoption of our 3-year water rates. That is the last piece of information the SRF loan folks will need to finalize the loan. And then we get final loan documents sometime in September, secure the loan and amendment, and then in October we can start submitting for reimbursement of the costs that we've expended currently on the desal reactivation. And that would be the opportunity to consider award of some type of desal expansion or award of a conveyance pipeline. So with that, my recommendations, adopt of a resolution amending resolution 15047 to include additional costs related to the reactivation of the desal plant and adopt a resolution authorizing the city administrator to execute a drinking water state revolving fund loan application for desal conveyance pipeline.
Thank you. I don't see any public comment speaker slips, so we'll open and close the public comment period. Quick question then. So let's say we get into an agreement with Montecito Water District. They contribute to the cost associated with this. The cost here is the full cost, right? So anything that they would contribute obviously would reduce our ultimate cost to our ratepayers. And is that right?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure that it's not on top of, this is the maximum amount. And so okay. All right, that answers that question.
Madam Mayor,
yes.
maybe this might help too with this. Based on these, particularly an expansion or the conveyance pipeline, the debt service on these happens 1 year after construction is completed. So I would not anticipate the full cost of these loans to hit us until 2020, providing us kind of that window, that buffer, in which if we do reach an agreement, we wouldn't really see those full costs, and those costs could be offset by some type of water sales agreement.
Okay, so I guess where I was actually headed was, should there be payment by Montecito Water District for their proportionate share, whatever the agreement is, that could actually significantly reduce the debt service over time, because we would be paying our piece, and there would be a way to, well, I guess if they're, never mind. We're getting the loan. Okay, I'm figuring it out as we go. But, okay, I know, I got it. I just answered my own question. Thank you. Mr. Hart, got it? That's right.
I was following that very carefully.
Yeah,
so.
Thank you. And you didn't have the conversation in my head also. That was,
I could hear the thought, see the thought bubble over your head,
you
too,
got
as
it.
you're
Okay.
describing. So did you look at horizontal trenching or horizontal drilling as opposed to open trenching, considering the unknown quantity of hazardous material, and is that a factor that makes it less expensive?
We did look into that, and there are several challenges. One is you're talking about staging in one location along the alignment, or there will be probably 2 or 3 locations where you would stage and do the drilling, and you'll be there for a month or two in front of someone's house. And that just seemed to be kind of one of those difficult, how do you mitigate that, versus where this likely construction would be in front of someone's house for maybe 2 or 3 days. There may be paving operations that come back and forth, but the bulk of the work will be moving and progressing. And the other factor that I think was helpful is when you get into some of that directional drilling, it becomes very specialized, and we're talking about just a small handful of people who could potentially do it, which I think kind of we lose a little bit of competition, where I think we do have some good local contractors who could go after this, what I consider bread and butter work that, truly they're tooled to do. And I think we really would get probably the best price with the open cut. And there's just a lot less unknowns with the open cut versus directional drilling.
But the biggest unknown is the quantity of hazardous soils. That's we just don't know until you do boring and you do testing. And
yes, and we come across it. I mean, this isn't infrequent. We come across it when we do our main replacements frequently, and we have a line item. And if we have it planned ahead of time, and you're going to run across it, it actually goes pretty smoothly. It's when you don't plan for it that it causes a lot of the challenges. So we'll have pricing for the removal of that soil, pricing to bring in clean fill. So I feel fairly confident we can manage this pretty easily.
Is this $12 million is a worst case scenario for those issues, or is that
it does,
that would be plus?
No, it does include contingency for contaminated soils.
Okay, and given just we've been down this, and that this is the time to ask all these questions again, you're confident that the scope of that contingency is in proportional scale to a worst case scenario, not just a experienced, general experience with water main replacement, but.
Correct, and it helps. We just replaced a 12-inch main on Calle Cesar Chavez near the intersection of Yananali, so we know exactly what we pulled out, so we know exactly how to classify it, where it needs to go. So I'm feeling a lot better. It's when you're surprised by contaminated soil that it starts to get out of control.
I appreciate you answering those variability questions. Thank you.
Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Hagmark, when you talked about the loan and the paperwork and whatnot the state has already with us, are they trying to calculate our ability to service this loan as it gets to the max through rates? Is it something we can bond against? How do they look at us, and what we can do for that next increment of the money it's going to take to complete the project or to get all the way to the expansion?
So they're going to be looking for adoption of rates, at least that show that in year 3 we would be capable of repaying such a loan. And one of the questions that we have a meeting set up for them to talk about is, should we enter into a water sales agreement, and our plan is in year 3 a revenue source coming in from Montecito, what does that, how does that look, and what do we need to assure them that would, be a legitimate revenue source? And so those are some of the questions that we're trying to work out as we move through this, because I think trying to adopt rates that don't show Montecito's involvement, I don't think that's palatable either.
Well, it'd be nice to be able to mollify the sticker shock that people are already feeling, and as this gets announced about the extra dough we're borrowing and going forward, it's going to be some questions out there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Dominguez?
So at this point in time, what would be the threshold, I guess, minimum water that the city of Santa Barbara, if we were not engaged with Montecito, how much water would we need to be having to add online because of the drought continuing in order for us to need this project, this conveyance pipeline?
Madam Mayor, Councilman Dominguez, that's exactly what we're working on right now. I'm very optimistic that we, based on what we have in Gibraltar and assuming we can use it, that we may have a year window where we can push off that decision. But our goal is to really start to ramp up this discussion about what size of facility, if any expansion is needed, probably in late March, and continue that into April as our supplies kind of shore up. We had a discussion today with the Bureau about when they might get around to allocating any inflow into Gibraltar and into Cachuma. Thank you. And of course, they didn't want to be nailed down on anything, and so we've agreed to set up some reoccurring meetings to develop some of these scenarios and timelines, because I tried to reiterate how important it was to us in our supply planning that we get some timely, confirmation of what kind of water we're going to be getting from Cachuma.
And then if we were to move forward with Montecito, would that change the analysis, or would we only move forward with them if we also needed the water? In other words, the drought continued and we weren't getting the other sources from the state, for example?
I think right now, given the unpredictability of our weather, but there is an option in which the 3125 is sufficient to meet both of our needs, and we'll be exploring that. Certainly combinations of that going up if we need more.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. White?
I'm ready to make a motion, Madam Mayor. Okay. I would move the staff recommendation and the approving Resolution 15047. And let's see, do I need anything else there? Yeah.
Okay, is there a second? Second by Rouse. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Questions, if I could. Regardless of what we do with Montecito, we're going to use this pipeline.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, I don't think that's predetermined yet. I think we're just leaving our options open. We do not
So we might not have to build it?
We do not need this pipeline based on our current capacity.
So maybe you answered my question to somebody else, but I missed it. When do we make that decision?
It'll likely be time with the water supply discussion in March, April timeframe.
And this trenching that you're talking about, aren't we crossing all sorts of infrastructure? And in fact, we probably don't even know exactly where it all is. Sewers and telephone lines, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. We're going to be relying on the city's record drawings. And, of course, we're doing an extensive survey right now to document what's out there.
But there are going to be a lot of surprises.
But there are ways. We do this all the time. We replace roughly 3 miles of pipe every year. When we do our water main replacement, this is consistent.
But that's where existing water mains already are.
Not necessarily, because typically we leave the water main we're abandoning. We leave that, and we're putting in a new one separately.
I didn't know
and
that.
And then the idea is 100 years from now, you can go back and use where that old main is, just because you need to keep all those customers in service while you're doing construction, so it's typically easier to put a new pipe in, then abandon the one that was there. That's typical construction. There are some places where there's no more room in the street. In that case, we do high lines, which is complicated. Anyway, construction activity.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I did not mention the portion B, instructing the city administrator to file this application for the conveyance
No,
public.
you said A and B earlier. I heard A and B. Or maybe not. Okay. Well, you said it now, so life is good. All right. Do we get a new road on top of this when it's done? I mean,
Likely. That is a great question. This trench is likely to be about 6 feet wide to get this. It's usually 3 times the pipe diameter is what the trench width is. So likely we're going to get a new street when we're done.
So we're not planning to resurface or slurry seal or whatever this particular pathway in the next 2 years anyway. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to do it now and then have to dig it up again is where I'm headed, right?
We'll be sure
we're
to
coordinating.
Put this, yes,
Good.
we'll be sure
All
to put this
All
on
right.
streets list.
Yeah, I see Rebecca going like this. All right. All right, we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
That's unanimous. Thank you. Okay, any council member committee assignment reports? Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, first of all, I attended a COMB meeting yesterday, and it was and in that meeting we discussed the moving of the barge. The barge did get moved yesterday, and it moved from its original point was where it was really sucking the last out of the reservoir, and now it's moved back to its original spot, and there is more optimism in that staff than I have seen in my now year and X number of months on that board. That we really are going to get some more inflow in the next 2-3 weeks. That, I mean, they're just little grins on people's faces, and that they're very optimistic about what we're coming up against in the way of rainfall in the next 3 weeks. So, and that does determine what's going to happen with the barge. If we get a lot of water, then we're going to need to make a decision about whether we get rid of the barge, and what do we do to start heading toward replacement of that? Because we're also hearing month after month that Kachuma over the years is likely to be run more on this widely varying basis, where it drops down to these low levels more often. I mean, as a point of in this whole context, the South Coast has gotten almost no water out of all this rain in Kachuma. Fortunately, we have Gibraltar, but that water is reserved for the Santa Ynez Valley at this point. So, in any case, the barges moved, and the staff is really optimistic about the three that they're looking at the potential for 3 more storms in the month of February.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. At ABRS today, we had a presentation of a project that's going to be a movable public art, and I think we've got a picture of it. Is that right, Mr. Casey? I can't really describe it, so I thought I'd show what it is. Can you scroll down? Here we are. Not that. No, that's history. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Next. A little bit more. A little bit more. Sorry, this takes so long. This here. Like as I said, I can't describe it. But these panels that fit together, the only worry is that they're going to be so attractive that people are going to climb all over them. It'll be sort of along the tradition of the chromatic gate, very modern, very kind of, attention-getting. And I have no idea how this is going to play out, but ABR approved it, and I think it'll be kind of fun to see. Coming this summer.
Just for the summer, or is it temporary art?
Temporary art.
Temporary art. Great. Thank you. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I chaired the Community Choice Energy Committee yesterday, and we had a great update that effort is moving forward. The feasibility study will be ready in the spring, so I think in a couple of months. And we had a lot of members of the public there who were supportive of us seeing that forward. At the library board, our librarian, our library director let us know about something that's coming up with the county-wide library system. The city of Santa Barbara has long been subsidizing a lot of the smaller libraries, and it's this old system where at one time, the city of Santa Barbara was the hub of everything. Maybe some of you still think we are. But we paid for a lot of things for the smaller cities. So our library director is trying to make adjustments on that. And I think our council will have to make a decision to get tough and protect our library resources for our city library patrons. The Neighborhood Advisory Council sponsored a presentation about Neighborhood Watch, and I don't think it was as well attended as we had hoped, but I know Neighborhood Watch efforts are going on around at least the west side and other parts of the city. And then I missed last week's city council meeting. I went to Denver with New Beginnings Counseling Center to attend a Department of Veterans Affairs forum about, it's called Supportive Services for Veterans Families. So it's how to help homeless veterans. I learned a lot, and I'll type up my notes, and if I don't violate the Brown Act, I'll send them to the city council. I think that's okay, right, Mr. Casey, to report back on a conference that I went to with some notes. So thank you.
Thank you for doing that. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. At the regular meeting of the Downtown Parking Committee, we discussed the depot lot and a lot of the surveying that needs to go on to reestablish what the real property lines and easements are. To that end, we're going to have to appropriate some $60,000 out of reserves to have that resurveyed and get ready for our Amtrak and Greyhound leases and all that kind of fun stuff.
Mr. Dominguez.
I attended the Community Development and Human Services Committee interviews last Tuesday since council ended early, and went to cheer them on. That was their final night of interviewing nonprofits and getting ready for grants. I attended the Restorative Community Network meeting on Wednesday. There was a great presentation by Steve DeLira, who's the former Deputy Chief of Probation. I attended the Neighborhood Advisory Council meeting that Ms. Murillo mentioned, and there were only 2 members of the public there. There were several city staff members there and several of the council members, and it was a great presentation on Neighborhood Watch. So we have to figure out how to get that information out to the broader public since it's not a televised meeting. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think the International Film Festival went off very well. There was quite a few events all last week, and so that was really, really great. I also want to acknowledge Old Spanish Days. Last week they had their announcement of the theme for this year, which is Unity Through Community, which is something that Father Virgil had said for many years, and they're acknowledging Father Virgil in particular in his long-time 40-plus year service when he served on the board. And so it was a nice announcement. Just when you think Fiesta's not for months from now, guess what? It's upon us before you know it. Okay, and we have a closed session item.
Item 11, subject conference with labor negotiator.
Okay, and we will adjourn from closed session. We do not have a meeting next week due to the holidays, so we will see you in 2 weeks.